Hi everyone and welcome. We are going to be talking about some issues dealing with media and uncertainty and risk and a lot of things that are definitely related to how we understand health information in the media. But hopefully I think you'll find that a lot of this stuff is a lot more broadly applicable too. In fact, the first reading that you were assigned to read today, this one, I don't know if yours has color or not like mine, this uncertainty in science one. The reason I wanted to talk about that a little bit is because, as you can see, this isn't just related to health issues. Some of the examples that they bring up have to do with things like climate change and autism. And of course, the second article that we're going to talk about is all about the autism debate. And all of those debates are very important. And all of these conversations are really important to have. But what I really want to focus on, what I want you to take away from the summary lecture, are the ways that the media might be partially responsible for our perception of these different types of risks. And again, I don't, just to reemphasize, I don't want you to think about it as the media only being involved with these risks. I also want us to think about how the media might affect our perception of other risks in similar ways. For instance, I'll try to bring up the example of Ebola. So anyway, getting started, I really I enjoyed reading this article by Julia Galef, I think. What I really liked about it is that she doesn't even just start off talking about sort of how the media might play a role in shaping our perception of risks, but she talks about how science in general, how scientists might actually have a part in this too, for better or worse, not even saying that it should change. It's just something we should be aware of. And I think a good way to think about this is thinking about science as a culture itself. If we think about science and scientists as sort of having its own social norms and its own culture, then I think what she's trying to argue becomes a little bit more clear. And she starts off the article, I love this, where she's sort of asking the question of, how is it that we can live in a society where we love scientists, right? Everybody really values scientists. If somebody says that they're going into a science career, right, it's like, ooh, you must be smart and we should revere you. Same thing with like medical doctors, right? We tend to put science and science-related fields on a pedestal, and yet there's sort of a contradiction because there seems to be all of this uncertainty with what science says or what the scientists say. So she's sort of talking about where this contradiction comes from. And I think one really good way to understand this is thinking about science as culture and how that might clash with other sort of cultural norms or values that we, and I think I am mostly talking about the United States here, but maybe you guys have some intercultural insight. So we in the United States, how it contrasts with other needs or values and things like that. And I actually do think that the scientific method is the best way to sort of encapsulate what that scientific culture is. So you guys may have learned this in high school when you were doing a science fair project, right? The scientific method, there's different sort of ways to visualize it. Usually it's in some sort of a cycle, right, where you make some sort of observations and those lead to different questions, and then you have to make sort of very educated predictions about how different, again, science variables should behave. And then the whole point is that those ideas get tested in a very systematic way. And the systematic part is very important because part of what's really important about the scientific method is replication, right? That cycle keeps going and going and going until some sort of theory can emerge, right? Until we have lots of different findings that are repeatedly finding the same thing or the same type of thing, leading us to say, okay, this seems to be what's happening. So it's usually not just based on one study, right? It's based on lots of studies that go through the scientific method. And I'm completely oversimplifying it, but having talked about that a little bit, I want to talk about how, as far as public perception, the scientific method could create problems, especially when scientists are interviewed about their opinions on different things, okay? Scientists who are trained, and again, I really shouldn't limit it to scientists. I'd say doctors to a large extent, and other health professionals too, who are trained to use the scientific method, right? They sort of have a different way of looking at the world. So it is kind of an intercultural issue. When you talk to a scientist about sort of what a consensus is. It's like, well, okay, fine. Maybe you don't know what's happening or if global warming is true or false, but what's the consensus, right? Well, think about it. Scientists aren't supposed to develop consensus. I mean, certainly, right, we want the development of a theory or something that sort of generally predicts different types of outcomes that we're looking at. But the whole point of science is not to necessarily develop a consensus, but to continually challenge what consensuses do exist. So once we find a consensus, we move on to the next question, which brings up another issue that was raised in this article where she talks about how scientists love talking about all of the gaps in knowledge. So if you ask them about like, oh, well, what do we know about you know, what's out there in the planets, if you're talking about like sort of like astronomy types of issues, or if you want to talk about some sort of like well, what do we know about like photosynthesis? Oh, God, I know. You scientists out there, I'm sorry for reducing this so much. But those questions aren't very interesting to scientists because scientists are trying to figure out what we don't know. Again, once we've already sort of reached a consensus on something, right, it's all about focusing on the questions that we haven't answered yet. And so that's what I mean, that this whole cultural orientation makes it difficult to, for instance, if you're a news person, to interview scientists about some sort of consensus, because the impression that they might give is that there are all these gaps out there because it's the gaps that they're thinking about, gaps in knowledge, that is. So I think what she's trying to argue is that people might often get the mistaken impression that science doesn't know very much because the emphasis from scientists tends to be on what we don't know. And what I'm trying to suggest based on this article is that that could be because of how the scientists are oriented and how they know to generate knowledge. Similarly, she brings up the fact that that word theory in general, I keep using the word theory, tends to have a lot of ambiguous meanings. In casual conversation, we might say things like, oh, well, I have a theory. But what we mean when we say have a theory, when I say, oh, I have a theory about one of my students didn't, why half of them weren't coming to class before spring break, right? I have a theory. But really, that's just sort of something I'm using in a very casual, tongue-in-cheek way. But what theory really means is more than just sort of a guess. As I had mentioned before, if a theory is developed, that means there's probably quite a bit of evidence supporting it. I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but that's another issue she brings up in that could be having problems when the media is trying to communicate science and health and risk information, is that when they use the term theory, and when scientists use that theory, it might not collide with the public understanding of the word theory. The other thing is that scientists, when they're going through the scientific method and when they're critiquing each other's method to sort of try to refine it and get better at doing the types of research that they're doing, might often revise things. Or it's like, hey, you know, we used to think that this was the cause of, oh man, my examples, you guys. We used to think that, oh, what's changed recently? Well, okay, we used to think that this was a planet. I don't know why I'm so into this. I have been watching a lot of Cosmos, but we used to think that this was a planet, but now we realize that this is a planet. Or we used to think that we were this far away from a planet, and now it's whatever. And fine, all of those are really interesting discoveries that people who like to read the geeky science news get really excited about. But for somebody who might not be as familiar with scientific culture, they might start to interpret this as a wishy-washiness. Like, well, science doesn't know anything because it's always changing its mind. But again, going back to the scientific method, if you think what the whole purpose of the scientific method is, to sort of uncover gaps, raise new questions, keep refining that method until we get more and more certain. It's not, this isn't, refining knowledge isn't necessarily suggesting that people don't know what they're talking about. I think another way of thinking about it is that when we see revisions like that, it's actually suggesting that scientists are getting more precise with what we do know. But again, this tends to be something that causes a lot of feelings of uncertainty among the public, okay? So anyway, moving on though about specific issues with journalism. So, because if you think about it, a lot of the issues that are being brought up by that article suggest that scientists are doing kind of a bad job at translating their own knowledge. And This article didn't really say that, but I would actually say that that's probably a true statement. I do think we have a problem with scientists and health providers alike communicating their knowledge to the public in a way that is easy to grasp. But since we are kind of in a unit talking about media and technology, I want to talk about those issues too that sort of came up mostly, I would say, in the article. Really, it was a book chapter about the Jenny McCarthy's New War on Science, which you could tell wasn't as much about Jenny McCarthy as perhaps maybe I actually would have liked to talk more about her, but maybe in the discussion boards. So one of the issues that's sort of subtly raised here, and hinted at in the other article as well, is that, journalists are trained to be objective. Yay for objectivity, right? We kind of want that, maybe. But then we get to this question of, well, what really is objectivity? And a lot of times, not always, but reporters are trained that objectivity is balance, is representing different sides of an argument. The problem is that that's not necessarily what would be considered objective by a scientific point of view. Objectivity in science, right, would be considered that scientific method would be being able to create replicable findings that other people can do no matter what their biases are and what their techniques are, et cetera, okay? But think about the problems that could be caused by a notion of objectivity that says that, well, so long as you're just representing differing viewpoints, that's objective. Well, what if one viewpoint is not very widely held at all? What if one viewpoint isn't even really backed up at all and one is? It would give the mistaken impression that both viewpoints are equal when really that might not be the case. And by the way, who's to say there's only two viewpoints anyway? I mean, you'll sometimes read news articles and you'll see that there's kind of a formula where they'll say like, well, this person says X and this person says Y and here's a middle of the road guy, as if there's just sort of three positions to be, but often that's not a true reflection of reality either. And another reason I think journalism likes this notion of objectivity is because it creates the illusion, or maybe just if it's not an illusion, it just kicks up some sort of controversy or debate, and that is ratings worthy, right? Journalists know, and news organizations know, that it's much more interesting if you can phrase things in terms of a controversy. And so that's another reason that sort of this system of the pitting two sides against each other works very well in journalism. And of course, the example that's being used here is the autism vaccine debate, which the question is why was a link between autism and vaccines only mentioned about like 400 or something times, the figures in the reading, in like 2000, and by 2005 14,000 times, even after the corrupt scientist who admittedly falsified some of his results had already, that had already been discovered and the results had been retracted. So what's happening there? And what this chapter is trying to argue is that, well, part of the reason, it was kind of like a perfect storm, which I have to say is why it makes a really interesting case study. But one of the reasons they're saying is because the media liked the culture war that was going on between the experts, the doctors, and these mothers that, I think it did a nice job of sort of representing the mother's plight, as these mothers felt very confused and very ignored. So what happened though? The media pits this as a culture war. It picks up a lot of steam. In the meantime, and here's another important factor that was mentioned, you have internet technology catching hold, and now people are able to go and educate themselves on the internet and form their own sort of collective entities, which in some ways can be very good. And we've read about some of these benefits in previous chapters. But in this case, I think she's arguing that it kind of it kind of fanned the flames that were already there. And then, of course, you had a spokesperson, not just any spokesperson, but a celebrity spokesperson, which is always helpful. Remember we talked about social learning theory or social cognitive theory. We'll keep talking about that actually, which mentions the importance of modeling, right? When you have sort of a role model to emulate. And I really think that Jenny McCarthy was a role model is a role model for many moms who are trying to figure out how to best care for their children with autism. But of course, I do think that, sort of the tragedy of all this is that, as brought up in this article, is that now we have this situation where there are competing risks, right? We have the risks because people aren't vaccinating their children. because they're scared of the risk of autism, of these much more pandemic risks of, contagious spread of things like polio and measles and rubella, right? And the thing is those risks might not seem very salient to people because it's not something that we see. Whereas if in the media we're seeing statistics about the rise of autism, and we might also be having more interpersonal contact with people with autism, et cetera, that risk becomes more salient, and the media sort of just keeps feeding into that. But this is, kind of, it'll be interesting to see where this goes, and I really want you to think about this, because this is something that I think is an important message, which is that, the article that we just read makes the point that public concerns for different types of risks always increase when there is more media coverage of that risk. And think about how this relates back to Ebola, right? Ebola for, about like 2 months or so was in the news media, top story for ever and ever and ever. And that was when we had a couple of people who were diagnosed with Ebola in the United States. And since then, not much Ebola. Does that mean that the risk of Ebola has actually disappeared? No. Does it mean that the risk of Ebola in the United States has decreased? Maybe, but we also have to question about whether it was that much of a risk to begin with, or was it just on the top of our minds because we were seeing it in the media a lot. This is actually called, this relates back to a theory called agenda setting, which talks about how sometimes the media doesn't necessarily tell us how to think about an issue, but the media is very good at telling us what to think about. So the media might not necessarily tell us what to think about autism, but the fact that we're always thinking about autism would be the way that it sort of puts that risk in our face and makes it, for instance, more salient than other risks that are associated with not vaccinating children. So, on that, I would like you to know sort of that function of the media, because regardless of whether, the media is telling us what to think about climate change or global warming or whatever you want to call it, that's a whole nother framing issue. I do think that one pretty strong effect that the media can have as far as how we think about our health and different health risks is by just telling us which risks to consider important or not. And I think that does it. As usual, this is a pretty long episode, but yeah, I think these are all really interesting issues, and I look forward to seeing actually kind of how the autism vaccine debate changes as the media does start talking more about those other risks. So I guess stay tuned, right? All right. Thank you so much, guys. Bye.